There are some true crime cases that remain in history because of the crime itself. And then there are cases that seem to leave a second shadow. A shadow that moves beyond courtrooms, police files, and newspaper archives, until it reaches books, movie screens, and the private imagination of an entire culture. Tonight's story begins in rural Wisconsin, on quiet roads near Plainfield, where fields stretched wide. Neighbors knew one another by name, and an isolated farmhouse stood apart from the ordinary rhythm of town. The man who lived there was Edward Theodore Gein. To some people nearby, he seemed shy, odd, perhaps, socially awkward, but often quiet enough to fade into the background. He did small jobs. He appeared in local stores. He lived alone after the deaths of his family members, and for years, his private world stayed hidden. Then, in November of 1957, a woman named Bernice Worden disappeared from her hardware store in Plainfield. Her son, a deputy sheriff, noticed the signs that something was wrong: the open register, the missing person, the record of a local man who had been in the store. That trail led investigators to Ed Gein's farmhouse. What they found there would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in American criminal history. But this episode will not dwell on graphic detail. We will stay with the verified record, sway psychology often discussed around the case, and the strange way Hollywood later transformed fragments of this real story into some of its darkest fictional characters. Because Ed Gein was not Norman Bates. He was not Leatherface. He was not Buffalo Bill. Those were fictional creations, but pieces of his case helped shape them. And in that transformation, something important happened. A real rural crime became a modern myth. A damaged, isolated man became a symbol, and the lives of real victims were often pushed into the background. So tonight, we move carefully, not toward shock, not toward legend, but toward understanding. Welcome back. This is a calm, true crime story for sleep, written for quiet listening, black screen viewing, and a slower, more reflective kind of attention. Tonight's episode is called The Psychology Behind Hollywood's Darkest Characters. Ed Gein. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in Wisconsin, and became known after his arrest in 1957 near Plainfield. He admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, though he was tried and found guilty in the Worden case. He was later found legally insane and spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions, dying in 1984. This case contains disturbing material, but the telling tonight will be restrained. We will focus on background, documented facts, psychological themes, and cultural influence, while avoiding graphic description. So settle in, let the room become quiet, and let us begin not with Hollywood, but with the rural Wisconsin world that came long before it. Edward Gein's life began far from the movie screens that would later echo parts of his story. He was born into a family shaped by hardship, emotional control, and isolation. His father, George Gein, was often described in later accounts as unstable and unsuccessful in work. His mother, Augusta Gein, became the dominant figure in the household. She was strict, deeply religious, and intensely protective of her sons. Ed had one older brother, Henry. The family eventually settled on a farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin. The farm was isolated enough to create distance between the Gein boys and the wider world. That distance mattered. In childhood, social life helps build confidence, boundaries, and emotional understanding. For Ed, the home appears to have been the strongest force in his world. Augusta reportedly warned her sons against outside influence. She taught them to distrust much of the world beyond the family. She held rigid views about sin, women, and morality. In many accounts, Ed's later emotional life cannot be separated from his attachment to her. But it is important to say this carefully. A difficult childhood does not excuse murder. A controlling parent does not create violence on its own. Most people who experience grief, isolation, or emotional control do not harm others. The psychology of Ed Gein is not a simple equation. It is not one cause leading neatly to one outcome. It is a case involving isolation, loss, possible psychosis, fixation, secrecy, and opportunity. And like many famous cases, it became simplified after the fact. People wanted a single explanation. They wanted to understand how someone so quiet could become connected to such disturbing acts. The answer, as far as history allows us to see it, is layered and incomplete. Ed's father died in 1940. His brother Henry died in 1944 during a fire on the family property. Some later writers have raised questions about that death, but it was officially treated as accidental, and Ed was not charged in connection with it. Then, in 1945, Augusta died. For Ed, this seems to have been the central emotional rupture of his life. After his mother's death, he remained alone in the farmhouse. Some rooms connected to her were reportedly preserved, while other parts of the house became neglected. This image later became part of the mythology of the case. A man alone in a decaying house, surrounded by the remains of memory, unable to move forward. That is where Hollywood found one of its most powerful themes: the lonely house, the preserved mother, the blurred line between grief and delusion. But before those themes became fiction, they were part of a real and tragic life. Plainfield was a small community. People knew Ed. Some found him strange. Some thought he was harmless. He babysat at times. He did occasional work. He could be polite. He did not seem, from the outside, like someone who would one day be at the center of a national crime story. This is one of the unsettling truths of the case. Danger does not always arrive with a dramatic warning. Sometimes it exists quietly, hidden behind routine. The first confirmed victim connected to Ed Gein was Mary Hogan. Mary operated a tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin. In December of 1954, she disappeared. There were signs that violence had occurred, but Mary herself was gone. For years, the case remained unresolved. Later, after his arrest, Ed Gein admitted to killing Mary Hogan. He also admitted to killing Bernice Worden. Britannica records that Gein confessed to both killings, while his formal conviction was for Worden's murder. Nearly 3 years after Mary Hogan disappeared, another woman vanished. Her name was Bernice Worden. Bernice ran a hardware store in Plainfield. On November 16, 1957, her son Frank Worden, who was a deputy sheriff, came to the store and found that his mother was missing. The cash register was open. The scene suggested something serious had happened. Frank noticed that Ed Gein had been in the store recently. There was also a sales receipt connected to him. That detail mattered. In many investigations, the first real path forward is not dramatic. It is practical. A receipt, a witness, a familiar name, a memory of who was seen and when. Authorities located Ed Gein later that day and took him into custody. Then they went to his farmhouse. The search of that house revealed evidence that shocked investigators and later shocked the country. Authorities found Bernice Worden's remains and evidence that Gein had removed human remains from graves. The details became infamous, but for this telling, it is enough to say that the scene showed both homicide and grave desecration. Britannica describes the case as involving 2 murders and grave robberies in which Gein used human remains to make objects. The discovery was overwhelming, but the victims must not be lost inside the horror of the scene. Mary Hogan was not just part of a famous case. She was a woman with a life, a business, and people who knew her. Bernice Worden was not just the person whose disappearance exposed the crime. She was a mother, a shopkeeper, and a member of a small community. Their names belong at the center. Mary Hogan, Bernice Worden. For Plainfield, the arrest of Ed Gein was not a distant headline. It was local, personal, immediate. People had seen him in town. Some had spoken with him. Some may have trusted him. And now, the familiar map of their community had changed. A road was no longer just a road. A farmhouse was no longer just a farmhouse. A quiet man was no longer simply odd. Once Ed Gein was in custody, the investigation had to separate fact from fear. That was not easy. The case attracted enormous attention. Reporters came. Rumors spread. People wanted to know how many victims there were, what had happened inside the house, and whether other unsolved cases could be connected to him. But the verified record is narrower than the legend. Gein admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He was not proved to be responsible for a long series of murders. The number of confirmed murder victims remains 2. Investigators also examined his claims about grave robberies. He said he had removed remains from local cemeteries. Authorities checked graves connected to his statements, and the evidence supported that part of the case. In the legal process, Gein was first found mentally unfit to stand trial. Years later, in 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. He was found guilty, but legally insane, and returned to psychiatric custody. This is where the psychology of the case becomes central. The question was not simply whether Ed Gein had done the acts. The evidence and his admissions answered much of that. The legal question became whether he was mentally responsible under the law. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, according to Britannica's summary of the case, and he was confined in psychiatric institutions. But again, care is needed. Mental illness should never be treated as a synonym for violence. Most people with mental health conditions are not violent. In this case, however, severe mental illness was part of the legal and clinical record, and it shaped the final outcome. Ed Gein spent the rest of his life institutionalized. He died on July 26, 1984, at age 77. The farmhouse itself did not remain as a permanent landmark. After the arrest, curiosity around it became intense. People wanted to see it. Some treated it almost like a dark attraction. Before it could become a lasting public object, the house burned down in 1958. The physical house disappeared. The cultural house did not. In the American imagination, it remained a lonely house, a hidden room, a dead mother's influence, a man whose private world had become dangerously detached from ordinary reality. Those ideas traveled from Wisconsin into fiction, and fiction reshaped them. When people ask about the psychology of Ed Gein, they often begin with one question: how could a person become like this? It is a natural question, but it is also a dangerous one if we expect a simple answer. Human behavior, especially in extreme criminal cases, is rarely explained by one cause. In Gein's case, several themes appear again and again in serious discussions: isolation, attachment, grief, possible psychosis, control, fantasy, identity disturbance. But these are themes, not excuses. Ed Gein's isolation was extreme. After the deaths of his father, brother, and mother, he lived alone on the farm. His mother's death seems to have affected him profoundly. Reports describe him as preserving parts of the home associated with her, as though time could be stopped. In psychology, Grief can sometimes become complicated. Most grief changes over time. It remains painful, but it becomes integrated into life. The person slowly accepts that the lost loved one is gone, even while continuing to love and remember them. But in some cases, grief becomes frozen. The person does not move forward. The lost figure remains psychologically present in an intense and consuming way. In Gein's case, his attachment to Augusta seems to have continued in a distorted form after her death. Hollywood would later turn this theme into one of its most famous images: a son unable to separate from the memory of his mother. But the fictional version is cleaner than reality. Real psychology is less theatrical. It is quieter. It develops over years. It is made of habits, beliefs, private rituals, loneliness, and thoughts that may become more detached from reality over time. Gein's case also involved grave robbery, which points toward a world of fantasy and fixation rather than ordinary criminal motivation. He was not committing robberies for money. He was not carrying out organized crimes for status. His acts reflected a private psychological world that investigators and psychiatrists struggled to understand. That private world appears to have drawn heavily on his mother, on death, and on a disturbed relationship to identity and the human body. Again, we do not need graphic detail to understand the seriousness. The pattern itself is enough. A man cut off from others, a man fixated on the dead, a man living among signs of decay and preservation, a man whose inner world had become so powerful that ordinary moral boundaries collapsed. One reason the case became so influential is that it touched deep fears: the fear of the isolated house, the fear of the person who seems harmless, the fear that someone's inner life may be completely different from the face they show the world, and perhaps most strongly, the fear of the family bond becoming distorted. The parent-child relationship is usually associated with care, protection, and identity. In the Gein case, that bond became central to public attempts to understand him. His devotion to his mother, his inability to move beyond her death, and the reported preservation of her rooms all became symbols. Hollywood saw those symbols and turned them into characters. Ed Gein's crimes influenced several major fictional horror characters. The most famous examples are Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. Britannica and other summaries of the case commonly note this influence. But influence does not mean duplication. This is important. Hollywood did not simply retell Ed Gein's life. Instead, writers and filmmakers took fragments of the case and transformed them into fiction. Norman Bates, in Psycho, reflects the theme of the isolated man and the overwhelming presence of the mother. The story uses a motel, a house, and a fractured identity to explore hidden violence beneath ordinary appearances. The connection to Gein is thematic, not literal. Leatherface, in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, reflects different fragments: rural isolation, the terrifying house, and the use of human remains as part of the environment. But Leatherface belongs to a fictional Texas family and a very different story world. The film is not a factual account of Gein. Buffalo Bill, in The Silence of the Lambs, draws from another set of disturbing themes connected to identity and the body. But again, the character is fictional. The story combines influences from multiple real cases and fictional invention. This is how true crime becomes myth. A real case enters the public record. Then, artists take pieces of it, they exaggerate some parts, they remove others, they merge facts with fears, and eventually, the fiction becomes better known than the truth. For many people, Ed Gein is known less as a real person than as the shadow behind fictional monsters. But that creates a problem. When the fiction becomes louder than the facts, the victims fade. The psychology becomes simplified, and the real case becomes a kind of dark folklore. A respectful telling has to separate these layers. There is Ed Gein, the documented offender. There are Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, the victims. There is Plainfield, the real community. There is the legal record. There is the psychiatric record. And then there is Hollywood, which took elements of the story and made them symbolic. The symbols are powerful, but they are not the same as truth. Hollywood returned to the Gein case because it contained themes that horror could easily understand. Not because the real story was simple, but because the symbols were strong. The isolated house, the dead mother, the quiet man, the rural setting, the hidden room, the discovery after a disappearance. The gap between appearance and reality. These are building blocks of modern horror. They speak to fears that are older than cinema. The fear that home can become unsafe. The fear that family can become controlling. The fear that grief can turn inward and become something strange. The fear that what is hidden may be worse than what is seen. But Hollywood often sharpens these fears into dramatic shapes. A character becomes more theatrical. A setting becomes more stylized. The psychology becomes easier to recognize in a 2-hour story. Real life is not like that. Real life is slower. It is confusing. It is full of missed signs and incomplete explanations. In Ed Gein's real life, there was no dramatic soundtrack. There were years of loneliness. There were neighbors who noticed oddness but not danger. There were victims going about ordinary days. There were investigators following practical clues. The true story is quieter than the movies, and in many ways, that makes it more unsettling. Because it happened not in a Gothic castle or a fictional motel, but in a recognizable town, a hardware store, a tavern, a farmhouse, a rural road. The ordinary world did not prevent the crime, it concealed it. When discussing psychology in true crime, there is a line that should never be crossed. To explain is not to excuse. Understanding the forces that shaped Ed Gein's life does not reduce his responsibility for the harm done to Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. A person can be mentally ill and still cause real harm. A person can have a painful childhood and still be accountable. A person can be isolated and still make choices that devastate others. The legal system in Gein's case found him guilty but legally insane. That outcome recognized both the act and the psychiatric condition. It did not undo the deaths. It did not restore the victims. It did not heal Plainfield. It simply determined where he would spend the rest of his life. For the community, the aftermath was not theoretical. People had to live with the knowledge that someone they had seen around town had been hiding a private world of crime. They had to answer questions from reporters. They had to watch outsiders become fascinated with their pain. And over time, they had to see the case become entertainment. That may be one of the most difficult parts of true crime history. Some cases become so famous that they stop feeling real to the public, but they never stop being real to those closest to them. Ed Gein died in 1984, decades after his arrest. By then, the fictional shadows inspired by his case had already become part of American culture. Norman Bates had entered film history. Leatherface had become an icon of horror. Buffalo Bill would later become one of cinema's most discussed fictional killers. But behind those characters was not a legend. There was a real case. A quiet Wisconsin town, a lonely farmhouse. 2 confirmed victims, Mary Hogan, Bernice Worden. There was also a man whose life showed the danger of isolation, fixation, and severe mental disturbance left hidden for too long. Hollywood took pieces of that story and turned them into nightmares. But true crime asks for something different. Not just fear, not just fascination, not just the thrill of recognizing where a movie idea came from. It asks for memory. It asks us to separate fact from fiction. It asks us to keep the victims visible. And it asks us to understand that the darkest characters on screen are often simplified versions of something much sadder, quieter, and more human in real life. The story of Ed Gein is not only about what was found in a farmhouse. It is about what can happen when grief becomes frozen, when isolation deepens, when reality becomes distorted, and when a community cannot see the danger hidden in plain sight. The movies made the shadow larger, but the real story remains smaller, colder, closer. A road outside Plainfield, a store left unattended, a name on a receipt, a farmhouse in the dark, and a case that still reminds us, decades later, to be careful with the stories we inherit. Because some stories are not legends. They are wounds. Thank you for listening to this calm, true crime story for sleep. Tonight, we looked at Ed Gein through the lens of psychology, documented crime history, and Hollywood's transformation of real events into fictional characters. As always, the purpose here is not to sensationalize, but to remember carefully, speak gently, and let the facts remain clear. Rest well, and take care of yourself.